have the distinct pleasure of introducing Mr. Doyle Dice to you this morning. And
Hello, hello, testing, 1, 2, 3. 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 Hello, hello, testing, 1, 2, 3.
can always just get up and use that since I'm just here. Well, I was just thinking I was late.
No, you could. A few minutes to go.
Okay. Just felt like there was an air of expectation in the air and I was holding everyone up, which would not surprise me at all.
Fear and expectation may be true.
Probably won't need it all now that I'm that prepared.
Are you all right for saying?
I am. Yep.
You're welcome to test it.
We're not going to... Okay, that doesn't seem like it's going to interact. Carry on. I was just testing.
Give it a bit of time to kick in.
Yep.
Well, welcome everyone. A particular welcome given that there's a certain AFL final on this evening, and so your sacrifice may have been greater than usual. There are 15 people registered as online participants, and I'm sure there will be others who will have a chance to look at this a bit later on. So firstly, we in this place acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that we're meeting on. We acknowledge that we gather on the land of the Kaurna people, whose spiritual connection and care flows through the generations. We pay our respects to elders past and present and give thanks for the opportunity to live among First Nations people who are part of the oldest living culture on earth. And we commit to the ongoing work of reconciliation, healing and justice across this land now called Australia. Now, the format for tonight. So there'll be an introduction to the topic from me to get you warmed up. I will introduce the three panel speakers, panellists. They'll each speak for around 5 to 7 minutes, and that'll basically whet our appetites. I'll then ask a couple of questions to tease out things that they may have raised that I found particularly exciting, or it looked like they wanted to say more and they didn't have time. And then I will hand it over to you. So we're going to allow at least 20 minutes for questions from you here, not those online, unfortunately. So when we come to that point in proceedings, please raise your hand. If there's a flurry of hands, I'll choose one, then come out to this microphone here and ask your question in a way that those online can still hear. And please not a monologue, although looking around the room, I don't think anyone would be guilty of doing that. So after the Q&A, I'll thank the speakers, remind you of the next forum topic, and invite you to join us through there for coffee, tea, and I think there's red wine, and you don't need any of those things for fellowship, that's free. So on to my topic introduction. Tonight, we are using a very broad understanding of a progressive perspective. Obviously, our title up there is What Do Liturgy and Worship Look Like from a Progressive Perspective? So it's a very broad understanding we're using. It includes, but is not limited to, the contrast made in progressive Christianity by comparison with conservative and fundamentalist versions of Christianity. But we know that many of our forum attendees, like many Australians, find it difficult to subscribe to the ancient creeds or to accept some of the violence and prosperity for believers passages in both the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament. Yet many are deeply spiritual and believe in an ultimate holy creator being of love, peace, mystery and relationship, and have felt the warmth and guidance of some form of Holy Spirit. Many acknowledge the historical ministry of Jesus with his words and actions to support the poor and marginalised that led to his crucifixion by earthly, political and religious powers. But we don't want to replace a dogmatic, conservative understanding of faith with a prescriptive liberal dogma. That is why we seek to address and discuss questions in our monthly PC forums. A progressive perspective is humble and welcoming to our First Nations peoples and those of other faiths or no faith, deeply concerned for the future of our planet and its life that is not restricted to humanity, and supports unselfish actions to address conflict, suffering, and injustice. From such a progressive perspective, what do liturgy and worship look like? Worship is our response to a loving Holy One, or God who is other. And while we can pray alone at home or in nature, worship is normally a communal activity. Liturgy is the format of our collective gathered worship and usually includes prayers, hymns, songs and music, readings and reflection on the meaning of Scripture, and regular Holy Communion. But there are many different forms of liturgical worship with varying formality and theology. Now, none of this quick overview is meant to constrain tonight's speakers or your questions. It's just a bit of a warm-up. Why is it important to discuss what progressive liturgy and worship look like? Let me give you one example from my own background. My family attended a mostly liberal Catholic Anglican church from 1994 to 2012. Christchurch had a beautiful 1860 church building in Queanbeyan in New South Wales near Canberra, and its structure, pews and artefacts influenced what worship could look like. While working full-time, I studied postgraduate theology and undertook research on the theology of the hymns and songs used by the Christchurch family-oriented service every Sunday morning. The structured liturgy was mainstream Anglican and the preaching was liberal Catholic and emphasised the mystery of God and the need for Christian fellowship and service. The concern explored in my research was that the songs sung in the services, supported by an excellent band with piano, my wife played piano, guitar, drums and lead singers, were mostly from Hillsong in Sydney and other conservative, fundamentalist and Pentecostal sources. Their theology was often quite alien to the rest of the liturgy. And communal singing is an embodied practice that is very powerful. And we know that when those suffering from the scourge of dementia can still come alight through music and song they grew up with. Indeed, for centuries, hymns and songs have been used by denominations to instill their theology, doctrine and dogma. Two books I once owned had the titles Music as Propaganda in the German Reformation and Singing the Gospel, Lutheran Hymns and the Success of the Reformation. Needless to say, the Roman Catholics responded in kind. So today, if we are progressive and wish to have integrity in our worship, our hymns, songs, prayers, sermons and use of poetry and the arts, all of that needs to reflect our beliefs and not reinforce unnecessary and unhelpful dogma. Liturgical changes can help reinforce social justice, environmental and other progressive action. Now, let me briefly introduce the panel. I'm not going to read out what you should all have received, or if you have just come in at the door and didn't get a reminder, it will be on the ELC and Progressive Christianity SA websites. So, first speaker tonight, the Reverend Dr. Sarah Agnew, is Minister in Placement here. Her PhD was at the University of Edinburgh, and it involved an embodied performance methodology for interpreting the Bible. She's a biblical storyteller and scholar, member of the Network of Biblical Storytellers International, and importantly, given what I've just said in the introduction, she has written a lot of poetry, liturgy, rewritten the words to hymns, etc., to reflect more of a progressive outlook. Then will be Don Sinnott. Dr. Don Sinnott did his PhD in electronic and computer engineering from Syracuse University in the USA, and he's mostly been a researcher and leading public servant in the Defence Department, working in a whole lot of different areas and technologies. He's been a lay preacher in the Uniting Church for more than 40 years and continues to grapple with harmonising his Christian faith with being a scientist. So he comes from those perspectives. And last but not least, the Reverend Marion Millen was a geographer and teacher. She worked with refugees, had a call to ordination as a deacon in Western Australia, and did her divinity degree there. And she's been involved with the Uniting Church's Commission on Gospel and Gender, been a prison chaplain part-time, a congregational minister part-time, and has used progressive liturgies in those settings and others. So I hope you will agree that we have a nice mix of people to speak to you about the importance of progressive liturgy and worship. Over to Sarah.
Thank you. I'm going to stay sitting down. Is that all right with everybody? Great. I wasn't sure what was expected. Kim asked me to start us off with a bit more of a theoretical perspective. I've chosen three theoretical starting places. And some of them dovetail into and out of what Kim has already warmed us up to, so some of those ideas. I want to talk about singing, poetics, and play as three things that I think underpin healthy, progressive liturgy and worship. John Bell, who is a hymn writer many of you will be familiar with from the Iona community, talks about what happens when we sing. Kim's alluded to this already. Singing involves our whole being. It's physical, fairly obviously. It's cognitive. Not just that we're thinking what we're singing, but cognition in terms of memory, which is also emotional because we sing and we remember everywhere we've sung these songs before and the people with whom we've sung them. It's spiritual and soulful, and it's relational. The people we've sung them with before, and that really unique thing that happens when we sing and join our unique voices together to make one voice. Lately, it's blown me away. Almost every Sunday I've sung with this congregation because I don't worship here as often as I could because I've been ill. So that voice, that belonging, that being one together is really profound. Therefore, John Bell says it matters what words we give the people to sing. There is a gift in singing words that, again, as I said, that we've inherited, that we've sung all our lives, that we sang with our parents and our grandparents. The same goes for liturgy and prayers. There is gift in that. Kim mentioned the way that if you're a dementia patient, people have observed that they can remember song words, even, those familiar responses for the communion liturgy or the Lord's Prayer. It's really important that we have opportunities to bring stuff embedded into us. However, if we sing or pray words that no longer hold meaning, using imagery that is of a different time and place, that's not helpful anymore, we run the risk of creating dissonance for people, and that inhibits people's capacity to fully worship. And what are we doing when we're crafting liturgy and curating worship experiences? we're trying to invite people to encounter the sacred. So it matters what we invite the people to sing, to pray together. And in that way, I would hope that even worship that comes under the conservative banner is somewhat progressive, progressing enough, right, to incorporate the changes so that our inheritance is really important, and how we respond to it is also important. To hold it lightly, play with it, reimagine it for a new time. So those are the theories, I think, the embodiedness of singing and praying together, the poetics of language that is current and transcendent. And let's play, shall we? Let's play. One last thing on play. Thomas Aquinas said, if you don't know how to play, you don't know how to pray. Just saying.
Thank you, Kim. I'm very conscious that not only am I the only lay person here, and I'm also male, but I come from a very different background, and I cannot separate what I want to say from who I am. And so what I will be saying will be very much conditioned by the sort of person I am, the experiences I've had, and my background, which is mainly in science and technology, and Kim mentioned the public service. I've been in senior positions in defence. And if you think science is hard, try being the scientist in the defence bureaucracy in Canberra and try to persuade the generals that you know what you're talking about. I can label myself as a progressive, and I guess that's important, seeing that's the topic we're talking about. And I can call myself a Christian, but I am hardwired in the physical sciences. So first, let me tell you a story. Stories are a very good way of getting your message across. I want you to imagine a ball, perhaps the size of a basketball, floating in mid-air. This is stretching your credulity, I know. And crawling on this ball is my friend Bertie. Bertie is a beetle. Bertie the beetle lives on a ball. And so he spends his days and nights crawling over the ball, never strays from it. He doesn't have the ability to fly, and somehow he survives. He might sort of dimly recognise that at times he returns to where he's been before, but that doesn't matter. It's his world. Now, if we were able to give Bertie some advice, we might say, Bertie, why don't you have a look away from the ball? Why don't you realise there is another dimension? You are living in a dimension, a world in which there are only two spatial dimensions. You can go forwards, backwards, left and right, but you can't go up. So we'll leave Bertie to his exertions and return to ourselves, because we live in three spatial dimensions, and yet there is, of course, a fourth spatial dimension that most, if not all, people can experience, and that is of whether we call it the sacred or the divine or the inspirational, something which can't be explained by people of my ilk who deal only with science and the things that belong in three dimensions plus time. Bertie, if he was released from his ball, might be feeling liberated, might be feeling fulfilled, find a whole new world. And I suspect that when we enter into that fourth spatial dimension of ours, that of the spirit, that of the divine, we are finding ourselves liberated, having some new experiences, having life is wider than what we'd had before in our day-to-day work. And we associate this word G-O-D with this, we Christians, with this dimension, as if we understand what we're talking about. And I suspect most of the time we don't. And I also suspect most of the time it's good that we don't, and that mystery pervades us. The important and critical thing in experiencing this added dimension is it enriches our life. The day-to-day life which is lived in our three spatial dimensions is enriched by getting into this fourth dimension, not detracting from it. And that's modelled by Bertie's experience. If Bertie got off that ball, he would find the world a whole new, more exciting place. So when I go into worship, I'm seeking to engage purposefully with the sacred, which is an element of this added dimension I've talked about. And most critically, as Sarah has said, join in a community of other seekers who are also engaged in this other dimension. When I do so, I want to express my joy, my gratitude for life, thanks for the community in which I can meet, which I know, and fortify my commitment to live a good life. And that wraps up a whole heap of stuff about how I serve, how I treat my fellow person, and how I contribute to the good of the planet. But of course, here I come, and I bring some baggage because I bring my nature and my training and my experience, which is largely in science. And I suspect I'm far from alone. I think there are many people who would never call themselves scientists, who would never claim to be experienced in this world, who nevertheless say, hey, when I go into church to worship, I don't expect to check in my brains at the door. I still expect that I can ask questions and reflect creatively in ways that perhaps I don't normally expect to find in a church building. Let me say a couple of things about how science works. I'm sure this is not new to anybody. And I'm talking about physical science. So it proceeds not from assertions, but from experiments and building up observations, and then being brave enough to state a theory which we claim would be universally true. And if you ever find some examples where it doesn't work, you either ditch the theory or you start a new one. So, for example, when Isaac Newton came up with his theory of gravity in 1687, it seemed to work perfectly until it didn't. And Einstein's theory of gravity, which is the theory of general relativity, dates only from 1915 and was a sort of a patch-up job on Newton's theory. And that so far has been acceptable. And all of this exists in a world in which there is some uncertainty. Science needs to agree that there is some uncertainty, and we do our best as scientists to try and nail it down, but there still remains uncertainty. But regrettably, when I look at the institutional church, I see a structure that tolerates no uncertainty. My nature is to question, not to be satisfied with assertions, and I run into an immediate roadblock when I look at a traditional worship service. I'm sure not the sort of service that our ladies here would be running, but a traditional service such as I've experienced most of my life. When I see the service loaded with what I would call assertions, belief statements. So when I'm faced with an assertion in a general workaday world or a conspiracy theory, I'll always ask some questions, perhaps silently. Who says? On what authority? Or even, what's in it for you? And some of my friends are well acquainted with my approach to this. And I'd say I'd try to apply the same filters in practicing my Christian faith, which means I'm acutely uncomfortable with religious assertions and claimed certainties. If acceptance of assertions is a condition of entry into this added fourth dimension in space, then I see that adding that dimension is going to impoverish me, not enrich me, if I'm obliged to limit my inquiries and say, you can't ask that, you must accept that. Let me say that again, that I see that adding this extra dimension, this creative, spiritual, and inspirational dimension, impoverishes me if it limits my ability to inquire and to ask questions. So when I say or make a belief statement, I'm expressing an opinion. When I say, as I might, I believe the Crows can win tonight, even with the loss of Isaac Rankin. That's a sort of a belief statement, but an opinion which may turn out to be incorrect. So when I say I believe in God, which is the first line of any creed of which I'm aware, I can only understand this in sense of saying it is my opinion that God exists. And that is my opinion. but you need to cut me a little slack as to what I really mean when I use the word G-O-D, those simple 3 letters. But beyond that, I'm in serious trouble because it seems that worship requires its participants to believe a whole heap of stuff. The I believes are a heck of a lot of them in any Christian worship, certainly in the creeds. I have a faith, a confidence and a commitment, but I am very economical on beliefs. Christian tradition embedded in mainline liturgy is a highly evolved product which has some, and I say this knowingly, some, but I think surprisingly little reliance on the life and teaching of Jesus. Concepts like Jesus' relationship to God and the badge Christ that we so willingly apply to Jesus in his non-physical form is a construct of the church. The theories of the atonement, the need to ask for God's forgiveness and to accept that some human agent can dispense absolution. The Trinity, all these were developed to defend the core assertions of the church as they evolved in the first few centuries against heresies of the day. But for me, they're not particularly helpful. They stand in the way of my search for the sacred and the divine in their midst. They stand in the way of my searching for the mind of Jesus. It leads me to be uncomfortable with claims that assume knowledge of the mind of God. So I wouldn't react well to a prophet who appeared and says, "Thus saith the Lord." I'd ask those questions about who says and how do you know? What's the proof? I'm uncomfortable with assuming God is connected with some sort of divine communications technology where you can telephone to Jesus, was the old song. Rather, for me, prayer is a metaphor. We pray as if we are talking to God, seeking to connect with the ultimate reality beyond anything we can imagine. I'm uncomfortable with prayers of confession. Jesus, it seems to me, didn't require acknowledgement of sin as a precondition for healing, but he invited that as a response. Yet right up front in any mainline service you'll find a prayer of confession. And I must admit I writhe every week when our services begin this way, as if absolution is some sort of an entry payment for further involvement in the service. Similarly, prayers for God's intervention makes no sense to me. Laments do. The noble lament of David over the death of Jonathan and Saul is to me the model, where there is nothing being asked of God. It is simply an outpouring of sadness, of sorrow, of lamenting. But how often do we hear that sort of thing in our services? I appreciate the value of tradition and ritual. You might find that that's surprising after all what I've said so far. I can be inspired by traditional forms, by practices and words, by architecture. I can be inspired by stories. And there are many ways in which I can find worship meaningful, which rely on the traditions of the church. So what do I do, coming to the pointy end now? When I lead worship as a lay preacher, I have some control over what's included. I value my own integrity too much to effectively lie, to say things that might be traditional, but to me seem to run counter to those things I struggle with. The hunt for songs is a challenge, but it's a challenge that can be met. And there are plenty of hymn writers these days who are producing songs that I find do speak to me. And there is other material too that we can now dig up. But I have to be very careful that everybody has a right to worship in their own way. Everybody has a right to understand what God is to them, whether it's highly traditional, whether it's even fundamental. And I have to make sure the language I use does not exclude these people. We all have a right to worship in our own way. Unfortunately, progressive Christians run the risk of being known for the things they don't believe. The challenge for me is to sort of walk around that idea of belief and see that as a syndrome that's perhaps not for me, to express a deeper understanding of worship as a connection through a faithful community with a great well of mystery and unknown from which we can draw power. And finally, I'd like to quote something that Aldous Huxley once wrote. If you'll forgive me, give us this day our daily faith, but deliver us from belief.
Oh, thank you for that. I think probably it's mostly been said. We can go now. No. Well, I was actually most surprised to be asked to join this panel. But then I realised I have had quite a range of experience in helping to shape and lead worship in a variety of contexts, from a hairdressing room that also served as a chapel in the prison scene, through congregation and funeral services in Perth, to the induction of ministers in country placements in WA. I was the equivalent of the presbytery minister for the whole of country WA. But the reality is that in the past 50 years, starting with that walk on the moon and more recently the telescopes out in space, our planet is being seen as an insignificant dot. And our whole concept of who we are in relation to the universe and to God is also changing drastically. So I wonder what the worship of God means for us in this new era. Maybe, like me, your perspective has shifted into seeing God as an energy force permeating the universe. Or as Sir Lloyd Gearing puts it, God is the process of creativity itself, an activity that permeates the expanding universe, that impels the onward march of life, that is present in us and enables us to be creative. So getting back to Earth, I next ask myself, what are the commonalities? What's the bottom line I stand on when shaping liturgy? Well, first of all, as a leader of worship, I'm conscious of being trusted with a responsibility by a community, be it large or small, for holding a space where the divine energy that we call God, godness, may be experienced. And certainly where the loving relational vision that Jesus embodied can be valued and shared. You could tell by my accent, brought up on the border of Devon and Cornwall. And that Celtic sense of the between, the thin space, has long resonated with me. So when, during my ministry training, I came across Martin Buber's concept of the God of the between, as having the God of the between as being inherently present in the connections of our relationships, in the psycho-spiritual space that is between people. And then something in me went ping. As Buber put it, in the beginning was relationship. And I'm very much conscious that a worshipping community will contain a wide range of people, some seeking comfort or reassurance, some wanting emotional connection, others intellectual understandings. But I would suggest that nearly everyone is looking for what I call a meaning framework, a sense of hope as we bumble through our crazy human existence. So for me, holding this space has to be invitational, not impositional, which is probably why I'm not too keen on Nicene creeds, etc. either. And ideally, it's a space that is inclusive of all people, all kinds of people, having a chance to participate. And that sense of inclusivity also extends, for me, to being sensitive to the language and metaphors we use. I am not brother, I am sister, and God is not he. Ever since a female prisoner said, "Why would you call God Father? Mine abused me," I've changed my terminology to replace the word Father with the word Creator, or loving God, or Holy One. And I only ever use the pronoun he in prayers and hymns in reference to Jesus. So thank goodness for PowerPoint, so I can tweak wording and use modern versions for the Lord's Prayer. And that brings me to the actual liturgy format. After the gathering call to worship and opening hymn, I usually have a time labeled sharing news and notices. And the Old English word gospel, after all, means good news. And this sharing, in turn, leads into a prayer of thanksgiving, maybe with a leading question of what in particular would you give thanks for this day? And I thoroughly agree with you about the confession angle, the lament we can go with, because there's a lot we need to lament. And then similarly, when it comes to prayers for the world, I often ask, what people and situations do you have particular concern for this day? And in larger congregation, I know that this is being done with a book that can be written at the door as people come in, which is then brought forward. And of course, interspersing worship with the singing of hymns also forms meaningful moments of participation and connection with thin space, as Sarah's already highlighted, especially with the modern wording that you can find on websites like George Stewart's hymns, modern words to old tunes. And let us not forget the role of senses in our worship, and about engaging with a range of relevant metaphors. There are people that don't even know what a shepherd is anymore, so let's get real with all this. But then we come around to the question of how do we treat and engage with biblical texts? With honesty, I hope. Did Jesus say everything he is supposed to have said? Well, no. Take next Sunday's reading from Luke 14, which has Jesus saying in verse 26, "Whoever comes to me and does not hate father and mother, wife and children, brothers and sisters, yes, and even life itself, cannot be my disciple." Could he really have said this? Or was something happening in Luke's early church context to provoke this? Is the Bible as written literally true? No. But it does contain truths to be discerned. So how do we allow a discerning space? Which is why I use the term reflection time rather than sermon, and would much prefer to extend this into a sense of participation. But I'm aware that public sharing can be daunting for some and more difficult in a larger setting. Well, in my congregation ministry way back in WA, once a month I did manage to introduce Cafe Church, which proved popular amongst the younger folks. And we bought, I think it was about 10 folding card tables and placed 5 or 6 chairs around them. And when it came to the reflection time, which was usually based on the gospel reading, I would have some starting points or questions for people to discuss and share thoughts around the table, or the conversation would take off to where it would. And there were the ground rules about not interrupting and allowing each person a chance to speak. But there's also another easier way of participating in a reflection time, and it's something that anyone can lead. 9 years ago, I was asked to run a liturgy workshop as part of the 13th World Assembly of Methodist and Uniting Church Women held in Houston, Texas. And I produced this booklet containing everything in it to run a service, even if the minister or designated worship leader hasn't turned up. And it's something I'm sharing with my congregation at Seaford, since we are no longer with a minister at the moment, and we're missing Anne muchly. And it also, this booklet includes a different way of engaging with Bible readings, which is not dependent on one person producing a sermon, something which could be used when the worship leader hasn't arrived. And this reflection time is based on the Benedictine's order Lectio Divina, and it's a Latin for divine reading or holy reading. It's used as a meditative way of engaging with a text, as a personal encounter with God's word. But it does take a willingness from those gathered in worship. So what does it entail? Well, the gist is, when the Bible passage is being read, people are invited to be aware of any words or images that resonate for them, with their eyes closed, if so wished. And after this first reading, they're asked to sit in silence and savor any feelings, personal connections, or understandings that arise at this time. And then the passage is then reread, because it may have taken on a fuller meaning. And after another time of reflective silence, people are then invited to turn to a person other than their partner to share their insights. And in a smaller setting like this, the comments could be shared with the whole group, if you so wish. Of course, there does need to be different styles of liturgy formats for different contexts, with some needing more structure than others. And a funeral liturgy would be one, but it is also probably the greatest encounter with thin place, as I call it. And towards the end of every funeral service, I always include these words by Dorothy McRae McMahon, whose creative liturgies have inspired me throughout my ministry. In the end, there is passion, deep in the heart of God. It will not let us go. It travels with us past the moments of death. It rises again and again in the eternity of love, a mystery, a wonder, God undefeated. And I wonder if I can have one little instance that I can share with you. It was during the ministry training the deacon shared. She'd been appointed as a chaplain at the Kew Gardens Homes in Melbourne, caring for people with intellectual disabilities. And when these folk discovered she was from a church, they asked, why couldn't they have church time too? So she asked them what that would include. And the replies were, well, there needed to be a candle, a bell, a story, some songs, and the angel year too. So that's what she had put in place, with a handbell marking the start of a gathering, and a chance to share after the story that became a wonderful expression of their spirituality. And she also realized that wearing her alb was seen as a sign of respect for them too. I've called mine the angel gear ever since, though I've only now end up wearing on special occasions like weddings and funerals. So the sense of may have taken a bit more than your 7 minutes. Sorry about that, Kim. Okay, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, all three. Now I'm going to curtail my questions to allow you to ask your questions up here in just a second. But I'm going to ask one question, but before I do that, I was remiss in not saying there are some materials at the back, in the back corner there, that Sarah has been kind enough to prepare. And in particular, there's a list of resources on one page that we will also put on the website. So I do have a question for Sarah to start with, and then your turn, although I could ask questions all night, so I'd prefer if you did. So Sarah, what do you think is the potential of Sophia wisdom in progressive liturgy?
You wanted other people to have a chance. The potential of Sophia wisdom. I think it addresses a number of concerns that we would seek. I think, many progressive Christian communities would seek to wrestle with and find their way through. So there's culturally, we're really aware of conversations and ideas about gender. To open up Jesus as the embodiment of Sophia wisdom adds a feminine dimension to his divinity, which I think is beautiful. If you haven't read Sally Douglas's Jesus Sophia, that's one of the recent books exploring, and she does a history of wisdom, lady wisdom, and how there's a coherence within Jesus, and actually looks at how already in his lifetime and soon after, people were using the wisdom Sophia language to talk about who he was and what their experience was. So I think it does that. I think it helps us open up the broader question of language about the divine. And I think both Don and Marion have addressed that issue, that there's all sorts of limitations, you'll be aware of this yourselves, I'm sure, to a very rigid understanding of God and rigid language for God that has become established. Father, Son, Spirit, done. Are we? I think if we can recover language like wisdom, Jesus, as a hen, there's so much rich language that we can interchange. Even if you want to keep it within a Trinitarian framework, you can still provide a lot more layers and beauty and point to the diversity of who the divine is and how we experience the divine, that moves us away from the arrogance that Don pointed to, that we named God and done. We know who God is. I don't know. We can know God and we can't know God fully, right? So I think it helps us to be humble, and I would want that to be part of how liturgy and worship is shaped in a progressive. I think Don was talking about wanting to. Where was I going? I lost my thought. Wanting to keep growing, keep progressing, keep exploring, and experimenting and throwing ideas around rather than dogma. I love the movie Dogma, shows my era, 90s, Ben Affleck and Matt Damon. Great movie. There's a line in that, the 13th apostle says, don't have doctrine, don't have faith, have ideas. Have ideas. Yeah, which is very playful for me. Very playful. And I think that's what we need to do with language, is play and use as much as we can. And it's there in the tradition. I could say more.
May I add?
Yes, please come up.
May I add some? Oh, could I add something before that?
Oh,
No,
yep.
You want to ask a question? Okay. Sorry, I'm from my perspective, I think Jesus very much saw himself as part of the wisdom strand of Judaism more than the priestly. I mean, we have in Matthew 11, is it? Sophia, wisdom is vindicated by her actions. These are children. And of course, Jesus himself would have used feminine words for gods like ruah and chokmah and shekinah, glory, ruah, breath, spirit, chokmah, wisdom. Yeah, sorry, I've cut across you. Thank you.
Hi, so my question is about the issue of confession. Like you, I'm very uncomfortable with coming along going, well, here I am, what have I done wrong this week? Not useful. I wonder how we could greatly expand our idea of confession to not me, but us. Here we are. Here are some things that we are struggling with currently, and here are some things that are going rather well, and play with the idea of confession being an identifying of how we are being in the world at the moment. Have you got any thoughts on that?
Tons. Dorothy McCrane-McMahon I think she does a prayer that basically, instead of confession, it just says, here we are, we bring who we are. And I would pick up on your idea, Heather, of expanding what confession is, and actually that part of our confession is we are bound up in the systems that cause harm, right? The systems that are unjust and human-made and flawed and all of that. So for me, what we're confessing is not necessarily, I've done something wrong and I've strayed. It's we collectively are bound up in systems that are inherently unjust. We have some responsibility as part of humanity, and we confess that and hope with God to be part of the answer. And I also would lament more, which is what we're doing on Sunday.
I really like that idea of broadening it out. It's something I hadn't thought through well, so thank you very much for that. Because so often it seems that when the worship leader leads you in a prayer of confession, you feel as if you're like someone who's been invited to a party and forgot to bring the present because you haven't got any sins to confess. Not that you can think of off the top of your head. Haven't committed an axe murder this week, heavens above. So sort of raising it above the trivial to broaden it in that sense, I think is extremely healthy. I just wish we could do more of it.
My perspective is that sense of confession when it's all at that personal level. My perspective is more the social justice, the regret with things that are not happening in our society, and maybe the sense of us being able to do a little bit more for that, which where the word lament comes in, lamenting what is happening. So to take everything just all at that personal level, we're talking about community, we're talking about community responsibility. So that's a different dimension too. Thank you.
Can I just say one more thing? Keep coming. The important thing for me about that moment of confession, though, in our worship, is the point of the assurance of grace. We skip over that. We go, okay, your sins are forgiven, be at peace, da-dum. I love taking the opportunity to, in one of my congregations, we sang a doxology or something or other at that point, to sit a bit longer with God's grace and really receive it. So I think we could counter some of the problems we have with confession by making a bit more of an invitation into God's grace.
I don't actually have a question. I just want to add to that, expanding your idea of confession. I think it's a good thing to get a thesaurus and in the prayers say, we grieve this and that. We're sorry about this and that. We are horrified by this and that. We, whatever other words you want, but I think it's good to look through a thesaurus and you get different words and there are different levels of, there are certain things in the world that we're absolutely aghast about, and that can be part of the confession or lament. And Bruce Sanguin, who some people may know, who was an ecological spiritual person, has a great chapter on lament, and it's all about using those kinds of words to expand it beyond a simple one track.
Thank you to the three of you. I've just got a question for Sarah, just whether she could expand or explain or give examples of playfulness within the worship service. I was just, you started us off, but we didn't sort of...
Oh, sure. I like inviting the congregation to play. From big things like we didn't do a Christmas Eve service last year, or the pageant that you sometimes do, but we did invite our young family members along and told the story on Advent 4, and we dressed up. Anyone could take a part, dress up. We created the nativity scene here, the choir sang, and people didn't necessarily come up and be in the nativity scene, but they're still dressed up in their seats. Play. And I think there's a playfulness in when a couple of weeks ago we sang hymns, but our organist, I think it was our organist, chose different tunes for the hymns. Let's play. Just unsettle us a bit, make us a bit uncomfortable in some ways. The thing about playing and praying is about when you play, you're imagining another reality, and you're acting as if it is real, as if it is happening now. And if we think about the kingdom of God that is now and not yet, we're praying, we're doing our liturgy, doing our worship together, as if that reality is actually already. So I think leaning into that part of the playfulness, letting ourselves imagine. One of the other things I do that's playful from time to time is when we've heard the biblical story for the day, to then ask, I wonder, which is a part of godly play if you know that. But I use it in any storytelling and invite the people to just name, what's my question? What am I wondering? We don't answer the questions. We simply allow them to be and let our imaginations play and expand the story and expand our connections. So those are a couple of things. I could go on for hours.
Wanting to explore or expand on liturgy, where do you see the balance between following a familiar set routine and going wild?
Going wild, it depends on the context of things. If I could may I just read something I did actually write in this book here. When I started as a chaplain in a very overcrowded women's prison, there was no chapel. Instead, worship and meditation times happened in all sorts of places, including the library, the visitor centre, the hairdressers, on the grass under a tree, in the compound. So I had in my plastic bag, I always carried a small Bible, a multicoloured scarf, and some small symbols. And wherever I landed up, I would create a focus by twirling the scarf on a table or on the floor, put this candle in the centre representing the light of Christ, a small wooden cross rising above the pain and suffering of the world. And to this I then added a visual association with the Bible reading for the day, or symbols such as I had a stone from Galilee, a butterfly brooch, candle flame, abalone shell, and a Care Bear, reflecting David Suzuki's quote from his TV series, Sacred Balance. We are formed from the four elements of earth, air, fire, and water, held together by love and shaped by spirit. So there's this sense of including our senses in the play and bringing things to the table. It might be the bowl of water with the stones, or it might be something else that's visual that can be used and incorporated in the liturgy, but it also brings that sense of play in with people's imagination. That's not answering your question very well. You might have a better one, Sarah.
Could I just say, I've found that adults are not very good players. They come to church with a certain expectation of having a set liturgy and doing things in a sort of a holy rigmarole. And you ask them to play a game and they sort of freeze up. And a couple of times I've tried to do that, and I've only got to say they bombed out pretty badly.
Yeah. I'm grateful for this congregation that knows how to play. But to answer Tim's question, I think there's something important about the rhythms, isn't there, of the worshipping life of a community, and that you have a kind of a reasonably set structure, you know. And I could wax lyrical about the beauty that is in the movement that we have in our Protestant worship service, from gathering through blah 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 to sending. So I think there's beauty in sort of establishing that as a kind of regular pattern and rhythm. And then when you make changes, make them for specific reasons. So when do I do that? Good Friday, we often don't follow exactly that kind of pattern. We make that rather than a usual worship service with a usual liturgy, that's much more centred on the story and where we're confessing or expressing our sense of sorrow at what has happened to Jesus and how complicit we might be in systems that crucify him again and again. Those are kind of woven in more subtle ways, and you would recognise them if you're part of a regular worshipping community from what we do the rest of the time, I think. Switch in a lament instead of confession, that's a pretty straightforward swap. Sometimes the story might lend itself to a particular response, and you might want to bring your prayers for others up earlier or something, or tell the story way up the front. Easter Day, I'd start with the story almost. So, but I would do it in service of A, either the story you're telling, or B, a flow of worship that is going to, as I said with play, make the people uncomfortable enough that you see those elements differently. If you shift where the prayers of the people are, you think about it differently. If you turn it all upside down, you're going to actually see it. It's like using different words for the Lord's Prayer or hymns or whatever. You actually hear what you're saying, and then you come back to the familiar Lord's Prayer, and it resonates with a new meaning because you've got those other layers. So, does that address your question, Tim? It's kind of the familiar, and there's an intent about making changes, which I think means that we need to be really helping our worship leaders to understand what that grounding is, why we have the shape we have, and help our congregations understand what that default shape is, so that when we make changes, that it can resonate with some meaning.
Another question? I'm going to sneak one in because I have one that I wanted to ask Don. So he's talked a little bit about uncertainty and probability in science. As I understand it, the latest physics and cosmology talks a lot about fields and relationships in particular. And I wondered if you would like to say something about how that might be drawn in to worship and liturgy.
Yeah, I'm always very careful about bringing physical things into another dimension, that dimension which is to do with the sacred. I've heard people preach sermons that are based on the theory of uncertainty, which is a physical theory, and try and bring this into a religious, or bring it into religious language. And to my mind, it's too much of a stretch. I think science exists in its own world. It describes the physical world. I think you get into great difficulties when you try and mix it up with metaphysics and sort of put in some faith-based operations. And some of them, the worst exponents of science I've heard have been from who are ministers or someone educated in that area, and vice versa. The worst kind of preachers I've heard are those like me. So I'd say, let's keep horses for courses in a sense. I'm just very reluctant to mix the two disciplines.
One last question.
Can I talk loudly from here?
Yep.
This will be short. Recently, the deacons from the Uniting Church have returned from their World Conference in Tanzania, and the heading for the conference was Dancing the Faith, Drumming Up Hope. Now, are we going to ever do some dancing and drumming? I'm just making that comment and saying that's sort of way out for us, but other cultures. I don't know if anyone wants to comment.
You've got the mic.
We don't have drumming here, but we have dancing from time to time.
I've done dancing in church before with Pachelbel's canon.
Nice.
And it's a very prayerful way of moving, and it's an easy way of doing it. I mean, okay, it was a small congregation at that point, but yeah, it became a very meaningful prayer at that point when things were being lamented, especially at that point.
Yeah, I have from some storytellers in Queensland developed these drama bags, which are basically big pillowcases out of double weave fabric, and so they move in any direction. And you put them over and you stand on the human size. You put your feet on the bottom, and then as someone tells a story, you move, and you can create silhouettes that are kind of like, if you remember the old Good News Bible with the line-drawn silhouettes, looks like that, and it adds, if not dance, then movement and a real, they're in bright colours, and that creates something quite memorable. I haven't done that here yet. Well,
I must tell you about our experience with the Africans. At a period of our congregational life, we got heavily involved with sponsoring and helping African people settle in this community. And on a given Sunday morning, you'd find probably 2/3 of the congregation had black skins. And it was the most wonderful period because they drum and they dance and they sing and it was so releasing that it's an experience that will stay with me forever.
I know you've got a question, but I think we should ask that in the tea room. But right now, I'd like you all to put your hands together and thank our three panellists. Please do feel free to engage with them over coffee, tea or red wine, if I saw correctly. Yes.
Can I just remind people about the resource table? There are some resources from the Centre for Music, Liturgy and the Arts at the back as well. There's the list of places you can go and find resources that are progressive or progressive friendly, and Marion's books are also available.
Of that liturgy stuff that I did, and I also have produced a booklet that might be useful. I'm concerned about Christianity throwing the baby out with the bathwater, if you like. What is it we're going to pass on to our grandchildren? The essence. So that's another little booklet I produced. A few copies, if you want.
And the last thing I need to say then is the next forum in a month's time. On the 2nd of October, Professor Rick Saar will address the timely question of, is liberal democracy necessary for freedom of faith to survive? And without further ado, please...
That's October 1st.
It's all good? Excellent. So please now join us in the adjoining room and feel free to ask any more questions you may have of our panellists. Thank you.